London is shrouded in fog. Where others see chaos, he finds the truth. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes is back. Welcome to the channel. Put on your headphones, like the video, and subscribe. Let's begin. It has ever been my habit, in setting down the chronicles of my association with Sherlock Holmes, to temper candor with discretion. Many cases of singular interest have never passed my pen, not for want of incident or ingenuity, but because the circumstances attending them were of such a nature that publication, even with names suppressed, would have inflicted pain where none was deserved, or stirred embers best left cold. Of all these suppressed narratives, there is one which for years I resolutely forbade myself to recall in detail, save in the guarded solitude of memory. It is this case, known between Holmes and myself by no title at all, which I now venture to place before the public under the name The Case Dr. Watson, Forbade to publish. I write with a certain reluctance, even now. The events occurred during a bleak spring in London, when the fog lay long upon the streets and the sun, when it appeared, seemed pallid and exhausted, as though it, too, were burdened by the secrets of the city. Holmes and I were then in residence at Baker Street, our rooms presenting their familiar aspect of ordered disorder. Chemical apparatus upon one table, the violin resting neglected upon a chair, and piles of newspapers arranged with a precision that only Holmes could reconcile with apparent chaos. My friend himself was at that time in one of his curious intermediate moods, not sunk into the lethargy that followed prolonged inactivity, yet not fully aflame with the energy that seized him when a problem of magnitude presented itself. He passed the mornings in desultory experiments, and the evenings pacing the sitting room, hands clasped behind his back, his keen eyes abstracted, as though searching for patterns in the air itself. It was upon such an evening, with the lamps newly lit and the dull rumble of traffic drifting up from Baker Street, that the first faint thread of the case was drawn across our path. Holmes was standing by the window, gazing down upon the street, when he spoke without turning. "You are uneasy, Watson." I confess that I started. "Indeed, Holmes, I was not aware." "You have been so since dinner," he continued calmly. "Your hand shook when you reached for the claret, and you have read the same paragraph of the Times 3 times without advancing. You are troubled by something external to your own affairs, which narrows the possibilities considerably." I laughed, though not without embarrassment. "You attribute to me a gravity I do not feel. The day has been a long one, nothing more." He turned then, fixing me with that penetrating gaze which so often made me feel as though my most private thoughts lay exposed upon the table between us. "Long days do not trouble you," he said, "but anticipation does." Before I could frame a reply, there came a knock at the door, sharp, peremptory, and repeated in such rapid succession that Mrs. Hudson had no time to ascend before Holmes himself strode forward and flung it open. The visitor who entered was a man of middle height, wrapped in a dark overcoat, whose collar was turned up about his ears. His hat he removed nervously, revealing hair already greying at the temples despite an otherwise vigorous appearance. What struck me most, however, was not his dress or bearing, but the expression of controlled agitation upon his face, a look of a man accustomed to command his emotions, now finding that discipline strained to its utmost. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. "At your service," Holmes replied, motioning him to a chair. "Pray be seated. You have the advantage of me." The man hesitated, glanced once at the door as though considering retreat, and then sat. "My name is Percival Harding," he said at last. "I am a physician." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed. Then you will forgive me for observing that you are not in active practice at present." Harding stiffened. "How could you know that?" "The absence of ink stains upon your fingers," Holmes replied, "combined with the stiffness of your cuffs, suggests administrative rather than clinical work. In addition, your boots show the polish of a man who walks little, and the faint odor of disinfectant about you is old, not fresh. You have not attended a patient today." Harding exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening upon the brim of his hat. "I see your reputation is not exaggerated." "It rarely is," Holmes said mildly. "Now, Dr. Harding, what brings you to me at such an hour?" The physician hesitated again, and for a moment I thought he might rise and leave without another word. When he spoke, his voice was lower and carried with it a weight that immediately commanded my attention. "A colleague of mine has disappeared." Holmes's eyes flickered ever so slightly. "Disappeared?" "Yes, Dr. Alistair Kemp." The name stirred something in my memory. "The philanthropist?" I asked. "Formerly of St. Bartholomew's?" Harding turned to me eagerly. "You know of him, then?" "Only by reputation," I replied. "He was much spoken of some years ago." "Just so," Harding said. "A man of great intellect, of tireless energy, perhaps too tireless." He broke off as though checking himself. "He withdrew from public life rather abruptly last year, citing ill health. Since then, he has lived in seclusion at his house in Hampstead." "And now?" Holmes prompted. "And now," Harding said, "no one has seen him for 3 weeks." Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Men withdraw from the world for many reasons, Dr. Harding. Why should this concern you?" "Because," Harding replied with sudden intensity, "Dr. Kemp was not a man to vanish without word. He was meticulous to the point of obsession. Even in retirement, he maintained a strict correspondence. When his letters ceased, I assumed him unwell. When my own inquiries went unanswered, I grew alarmed." "And yet," Holmes said, "you did not go to the police." Harding's face flushed. "I considered it, but there are sensitivities. Kemp's work in recent years, his private research, was controversial. I feared that official attention might do more harm than good." Holmes rose and began to pace, his mind evidently already at work. "You have been to his house?" "Yes, twice. The servants insist he has given orders not to be disturbed." "And you believe them?" Harding hesitated. "I do not know what to believe." Holmes stopped before him. "You are withholding something." The physician's composure cracked just perceptibly. "I received a letter," he said, "or rather, a fragment of one." From his coat, he produced a folded scrap of paper, creased and worn, as though it had been handled many times. Holmes took it, smoothing it carefully upon the table. I leaned forward, peering over his shoulder. The fragment bore only a few lines, written in a firm but hurried hand. "Cannot continue. The consequences were unforeseen. If I do not see you again, understand that it was necessary." "That is all?" Holmes asked. "That is all that remains," Harding said. "The rest was destroyed." "By whom?" "By Dr. Kemp himself," Harding replied. At least, so the servant claims. She says she saw him tear it up and burn it. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed upon the fragment. At last he looked up, and there was an expression upon his face that I had learned to recognize. Not excitement, nor even curiosity, but something more grave, a tightening of the features that suggested the presence of unpleasant truths. "This," he said quietly, "is not a disappearance. It is a withdrawal." "Then he lives!" Harding exclaimed. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned to me. "Watson," he said, "what do you observe?" I hesitated, conscious of the importance he attached to the question. "The handwriting is steady," I ventured. "The language suggests remorse, perhaps fear, yet there is no appeal for help." "Just so," Holmes replied. "No appeal and no farewell." He returned the fragment to Harding. "I will look into this matter," he said. "But I warn you, Dr. Harding, the truth, whatever it may be, is unlikely to be comfortable." Harding rose. Relief and apprehension mingled upon his face. "Comfort is a luxury I abandoned some time ago." After he had gone, Holmes stood again by the window, watching the fog thicken in the street below. "You find this troubling?" I said. "Yes," he replied, "because it bears the marks of something carefully concealed rather than crudely hidden." "And what do you suspect?" He shook his head. "Not yet, but I suspect that Dr. Kemp's absence is not the most significant feature of this case." I could not then have guessed how profoundly that remark would echo in my thoughts in the days to come. For even as we sat in that familiar room, with the quiet comforts of Baker Street about us, the first shadows of a far darker inquiry were already lengthening. Shadows which, once entered, would not readily release us. The morning which followed Dr. Harding's visit broke with a dreary persistence of fog, the sort which clings not merely to the streets, but insinuates itself into one's thoughts. From our windows in Baker Street, the world appeared reduced to a narrow strip of pavement and the ghostly outlines of passing hansom cabs, their lamps glowing like will-o'-the-wisps in a grey sea. Holmes had been awake since an early hour. Of this I was certain, for when I descended to breakfast, I found him already seated, his long fingers stained with chemicals, his eyes alight with that inward concentration which admitted no interruption. "You slept poorly," he observed, without looking up from a sheet of notes. "I slept enough," I replied. "My dreams, however, were uncommonly restless." "Precisely," said Holmes. "The mind, when presented with an enigma of unusual texture, continues its labors, even when the body demands repose." I poured myself some coffee and seated myself opposite him. "Then you do consider this matter unusual?" He smiled faintly. "I consider it delicately poised between the commonplace and the extraordinary. That is what renders it dangerous." Before I could press him further, Holmes rose and reached for his coat. "We shall pay a visit to Hampstead this morning. Observation must precede conjecture." The journey northward took us through streets gradually thinning into wider avenues, until at last we emerged upon the heath itself, a bleak, undulating expanse, its sparse vegetation bowed beneath the damp weight of the air. Dr. Kemp's house stood at a remove from its neighbours, a large, square structure of dark brick, its windows narrow and deeply set, giving it an air less of domestic comfort than of guarded seclusion. Holmes halted some distance from the gate and surveyed the building with a scrutiny that seemed to penetrate brick and mortar alike. "Note the position," he said quietly. "Elevated ground, commanding a view of the approaches. Privacy purchased at the expense of isolation." We advanced up the gravel drive, our footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The front door was opened to us by a woman of middle years, her manner composed, but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "I am Mr. Sherlock Holmes," my friend announced. "This is Dr. Watson. We wish to see Dr. Kemp." The woman inclined her head. "Dr. Kemp does not receive visitors." "You have told others this same thing," Holmes replied. "Yes, sir." "And yet," Holmes continued, "you do not say that he is absent." A faint flush rose in her cheeks. "He has given strict instructions." Holmes regarded her steadily. "Instructions given when?" "Some weeks ago. And renewed since." She hesitated. "No, sir." Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed some private suspicion. "You are Mrs. Allen, I believe?" "Yes." "You have been in Dr. Kemp's service for many years, since before he retired from practice, and you are devoted to him." Her lips tightened. "I do my duty." Holmes smiled, disarming rather than amused. "Then you will do it now, by allowing us to enter." She stepped aside without another word. The interior of the house struck me at once as peculiar. Though scrupulously clean, it possessed a chill austerity, as if comfort had been deliberately sacrificed to order. The furniture was sparse, arranged with almost monastic restraint. Upon the walls hung no pictures, save for a single anatomical diagram in the hallway, yellowed with age. Holmes paused before this diagram. "Interesting," he murmured. "Not merely anatomical, but neurological." I glanced more closely. "The brain?" "Precisely. And note the emphasis. Certain regions marked repeatedly, as though the artist were less concerned with completeness than with a particular function." Mrs. Allen watched us anxiously. "Dr. Kemp was always interested in the mind," she said. "He believed it the final frontier of medicine." "Believed?" Holmes repeated gently. She corrected herself hastily. "Believed, sir. We were shown into the study, a large room dominated by a heavy desk upon which lay several ledgers, neatly arranged. A fire burned low in the grate, though the day was not particularly cold. "Dr. Kemp spends much time here," Mrs. Allen said. "Spent," Holmes corrected, almost absently. He moved about the room, touching nothing, yet missing nothing. His eyes lingered upon the desk, the shelves of medical texts, the waste paper basket placed with careful symmetry beside the chair. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the basket. Mrs. Allen nodded. Holmes examined its contents: a few scraps of ash, some torn paper, and, most notably, a corner of heavier stock, singed at the edges. He withdrew it delicately. "Watson," he said, "do you recognize this?" I peered at it. It appears to be part of a visiting card. "Indeed, and whose?" He turned it so that the remaining letters were visible. "Hard." "Harding," I said. Mrs. Allen gasped. "That card was destroyed on Dr. Kemp's orders." "And yet," Holmes said softly, "not entirely." He returned the fragment to the basket and straightened. "Mrs. Allen, when did you last see Dr. Kemp?" She clasped her hands together. 3 weeks ago, sir. He came down late in the evening, asked for tea, and told me he would not be disturbed again." "Did he appear ill?" "No more than usual." agitated. She hesitated. Perhaps thoughtful. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Thoughtful men do not burn correspondence without reason. Her eyes filled with tears. He told me it was necessary. Necessary for whom? Holmes asked. She shook her head helplessly. He did not say. Holmes thanked her and led me back into the hallway. As we passed the door to the cellar, he paused. "What lies below?" he asked. "Storage, mostly," Mrs. Allen replied quickly. "Old equipment. May we see it?" Her composure wavered. I do not think..." Holmes's gaze hardened just a fraction. "Mrs. Allen, you are protecting someone. I do not yet know whether it is Dr. Kemp or yourself." After a moment that seemed to stretch interminably, she fetched a key and unlocked the door. The cellar was dim, lit by a single gas lamp. Shelves lined the walls, bearing jars, instruments, and crates marked with medical insignia. Holmes moved slowly, his eyes keen. "Note this, Watson," he said. "Several instruments here are of a type no longer in common use." "Obsolete?" I asked. "Or specialized," Holmes replied. "Designed for procedures that have fallen out of favor." At the far end of the cellar stood a door, smaller and newer than the rest. Holmes approached it. "What is this room?" he asked. Mrs. Allen's voice trembled. "Dr. Kemp's laboratory. And you have not entered it?" "Never." Holmes tested the handle. It was locked. "We shall not force it today," he said at last, "but its existence is noted." We took our leave soon after. As we descended the steps and emerged once more into the fog-laden air, I felt a curious oppression, as though the house itself exhaled secrets. "You think Dr. Kemp is still here?" I said as we walked away. "I think," Holmes replied carefully, "that something of Dr. Kemp remains here. Whether it is the man himself or merely the consequences of his work remains to be seen." "And Dr. Harding?" Holmes's expression darkened. "He is more entangled in this than he realizes, or admits." We reached the main road where a carriage awaited us. As it bore us back toward London, I glanced once more at the house upon the heath, its dark outline dissolving into the fog. I could not shake the impression that we had been observed from one of those narrow windows, and that whoever watched us did so with a purpose as yet unknown. The impression that we were being watched lingered with me long after the house upon the heath had faded into the formless pall of the fog. It was not merely a fanciful apprehension born of gloomy surroundings, but a conviction grounded in those subtle instincts which, though often dismissed by men of science, have guided me aright in moments of danger more than once. Holmes, however, betrayed no sign of similar unease. He sat back in the carriage with eyes half closed, his long fingers drumming an irregular rhythm upon his knee, absorbed in that inward dialogue which invariably accompanied the early stages of an investigation. We had proceeded no more than a quarter of a mile when he spoke. "Watson," he said, "what do you make of Mrs. Allen?" I considered the question carefully. "She is loyal, perhaps excessively so, fearful yet not deceitful in the vulgar sense. I should say she is concealing something because she believes it is right to do so." "An admirable summary," Holmes replied, "and one that brings us to our first misdirection. Loyalty, when properly cultivated, may serve as a screen behind which the most extraordinary acts can be performed without arousing suspicion. You believe she knows more than she admits?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that she knows enough to mislead herself. that is often more dangerous than conscious deception. We arrived at Baker Street shortly thereafter. Holmes dismissed the cab and ascended the steps with an energy that suggested a fresh phase of activity. Once within our rooms, he moved directly to the mantelpiece, where a small collection of envelopes lay neatly arranged. "Correspondence?" I asked. "Of a sort," he replied. "While you were engaged in amiable conversation with Mrs. Allen, I took the liberty of requesting from her a list of recent deliveries to the house. She provided it readily enough. Too readily, perhaps." He selected one envelope and handed it to me. It bore the stamp of a medical supply firm, dated only 10 days prior. "If Dr. Kemp has truly withdrawn from all activity," Holmes continued, "why should he require fresh supplies? And why, more pertinently, should those supplies be of a kind associated with experimental neurology?" I examined the envelope. Could they not be remnants of earlier orders? Possibly, but note the frequency. He laid out several more envelopes. Regular, spaced at precise intervals, the habit of a man engaged in ongoing work. I felt a chill. Then he lives, and labors still. "Lives, perhaps," Holmes said, "but labor is a matter of definition." At that moment, a knock sounded at the door. Holmes opened it to reveal a young man, pale and earnest, with the unmistakable air of a medical student. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked. "Yes?" "My name is Edwin Mercer. I was advised by Dr. Harding to seek you." Holmes's eyes flickered. "Indeed. Come in, Mr. Mercer." The young man entered, glancing about with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "I fear I may be placing myself in some danger by speaking," he began, "but my conscience will not allow me to remain silent." Holmes gestured for him to continue. "I attended Dr. Kemp's lectures some years ago," Mercer said. "He was brilliant, terrifyingly so. His ideas were far in advance of accepted thought. Many of us admired him. Some followed him." "And you?" Holmes asked. "I assisted him briefly in private research," Mercer replied. "At first it was theoretical. Later, less so." "Less so?" I echoed. Mercer swallowed. "Experiments upon patients suffering from severe psychological trauma. He believed that memory itself could be altered, suppressed, reshaped, even excised." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "And you believed him?" "I saw results," Mercer said, his voice trembling. "Temporary, perhaps, but undeniable. Patients relieved of torment, at least for a time." "And the cost?" Holmes asked quietly. Mercer hesitated. "There were side effects, disorientation, emotional blunting. In one case, violent behavior." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Violence directed outward?" "Yes." "And inward?" Mercer nodded slowly. "One subject took his own life." A heavy silence fell upon the room. "Why do you come to us now?" Holmes asked at last. "Because Dr. Kemp contacted me 3 weeks ago," Mercer replied. "He asked for my assistance again. I refused. 2 days later, I received a letter." He produced a folded sheet, his hands shaking. Holmes took it, scanning its contents rapidly. "This letter," Holmes said, "is written in a hand remarkably similar to that fragment shown us by Dr. Harding." Mercer looked startled. "You have seen it?" "Part of it," Holmes replied. "What did you do after receiving this?" "I destroyed it," Mercer said, "or thought I had. But since then, I have been plagued by doubts. Dr. Kemp's methods were dangerous. If he continues them in secret..." Holmes raised a hand. "One step at a time. Did you observe anything unusual during your association with him? Any colleague, any patient whose involvement might be relevant now?" Mercer frowned. There was one man, an orderly at the hospital, a fellow named Blake. He was devoted to Dr. Kemp, believed him a visionary persecuted by lesser minds. "And where is Blake now?" Holmes asked. "I do not know. He left the hospital abruptly after Dr. Kemp retired." Holmes made a note. "Devotion," he murmured. "Again." After Mercer departed, Holmes turned to me. "We are surrounded by zealots, Watson, each convinced that concealment is a virtue." "And Dr. Harding?" I asked. "Where does he stand among them?" Holmes's lips tightened. "That remains to be determined. But note this. Harding destroyed part of Kemp's letter. Mercer destroyed his entirely. Both acts suggest fear, not of Kemp, but of what his work implies." The day wore on as Holmes pursued a dozen lines of inquiry, some by correspondence, others by brief excursions into the city. When at last evening fell, he returned with an air of grim satisfaction. "I have confirmed the purchase of certain specialized instruments," he said, "delivered not to the Hampstead house directly, but to a rented warehouse near the river." "A laboratory?" I suggested. "Perhaps. Or a decoy." Before I could respond, the sound of breaking glass echoed faintly from the street below. Holmes was at the window in an instant. "Watson," he said sharply, "fetch your revolver." By the time we reached the door, the street lay quiet once more. Upon the pavement, however, lay a small object, a stone wrapped in paper. Holmes picked it up, unfolding the paper with care. Upon it was written a single line: "Some truths are not meant to return." Holmes looked at me, his expression unreadable. "The game," he said softly, "has acknowledged us." And with that acknowledgement came the certainty that we were no longer merely observers of a mystery, but participants in a struggle whose contours were only beginning to emerge. The warning cast through our window that evening left neither Holmes nor myself under any illusion as to the nature of the forces now aware of our interest. Yet, if Holmes felt any concern for his own safety, he betrayed none of it. He examined the stone and its message with the detached curiosity of a natural philosopher regarding a newly discovered specimen, turning it over in his long fingers, noting its weight, its texture, and even the faint traces of grime upon its surface. "River clay," he remarked at last. "From the southern bank, if I am not mistaken. Rolled smooth, but not long exposed. Picked up recently." "You infer all that from a stone?" I asked. "I infer," Holmes corrected, "from 1,000 stones I have seen before. The message, however, is of greater interest than its vehicle." "It sounds like a threat," I said. "It sounds like a caution," Holmes replied. "Threats are blunt instruments. This is phrased with a certain philosophical pretension." He folded the paper carefully and placed it within his pocketbook. "Someone wishes us to desist, not from prying, but from remembering, an important distinction." That night passed without further incident, though sleep came fitfully to me. More than once I awoke with the impression of footsteps upon the stairs, or the creak of the front door, only to find all quiet. Holmes, when I mentioned this over breakfast, merely smiled. "Hypervigilance is a natural response," he said. "But do not discount the possibility that you heard precisely what you think you did. You believe we were watched?" "Observed, certainly," Holmes replied. "Whether from curiosity or necessity remains to be seen. Our next step," he informed me, would be to call upon Dr. Harding once more. "It is time," he said, "to test the elasticity of his truths." We found Harding at his consulting rooms near Cavendish Square, a handsome establishment whose outward respectability contrasted sharply with the unease that seemed now to cling to its proprietor. He greeted us cordially enough, but I observed that his eyes flickered toward the door more than once during our conversation, as though he feared interruption. "You have been to Kemp's house," he said, when Holmes mentioned our visit. "We have," Holmes replied, "and we have spoken with Mrs. Allen." Harding's lips tightened. "She is devoted to him." "Devotion," Holmes said evenly, "appears to be a recurring theme." Harding flushed. "You imply—" "I imply nothing," Holmes interrupted. "I observe. Now, Dr. Harding, I wish to ask you directly. When did you last see Dr. Kemp?" Harding hesitated. "I told you." "When?" Holmes repeated, his voice calm but inexorable. 6 weeks ago," Harding said at last, "at his house." "And the nature of that meeting?" Harding's composure faltered. "Professional." "In what sense?" "He wished my opinion on a manuscript," Harding replied. "A theoretical work." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "On neurology?" "Yes." "And memory?" Harding's face had grown pale. "You have spoken with Mercer." "We have," Holmes confirmed. "And he was more forthcoming than you?" Harding sank into his chair, passing a hand across his brow. "Kemp was brilliant," he said. "But brilliance, unchecked, may become obsession. I feared where his work was leading." "And yet you aided him," Holmes said. "I tried to restrain him," Harding protested, "to temper his excesses." "By destroying part of his letter?" Holmes asked quietly. Harding looked up sharply. "You know of that?" "We know you received a fragment," Holmes said, "and we know you destroyed the remainder." Harding's shoulders sagged. "It was a confession," he said, "or the beginning of one." He spoke of an experiment that had gone too far, of consequences that could not be undone. "What consequences?" I asked. Harding shook his head. He did not say, and I did not wish to know. Holmes leaned forward. "You wished, rather, to forget." Harding met his gaze, misery plain upon his features. "Yes." There was a knock at the door then, abrupt and insistent. Harding started visibly. A nurse entered, bearing a card. "A gentleman to see you," she said. He would not give his name. Holmes took the card before Harding could. It was blank. "Show him in," Holmes said. The man who entered was tall, powerfully built, with a scar running from temple to jaw. His eyes were intense, almost fanatical. "Dr. Harding," he said, ignoring us. "You have betrayed him." Holmes stepped between them. "On the contrary," he said, "Dr. Harding has merely delayed the inevitable." The man's gaze snapped to Holmes. "You are Holmes." "I am." "You should not involve yourself," the man said. "Some knowledge destroys the knower." "An opinion often expressed by those who wish to monopolize it," Holmes replied. The man laughed harshly. "Kemp sought to heal minds. You would expose him as a criminal." "Would you?" Holmes asked. The man hesitated, just perceptibly. "I would protect him." "Even from himself?" Holmes pressed. For a moment, something like doubt flickered in the man's eyes. Then it was gone. Without another word, he turned and left. Harding collapsed back into his chair. "That was Blake," he whispered. "So I surmised," Holmes said. "A devoted acolyte, prepared to threaten, but not yet to kill." "Yet," I murmured. Holmes's eyes met mine. "Yet." We left Harding shaken and silent. As we stepped out into the street, Holmes drew a deep breath. "Memory," he said, is the battlefield upon which this struggle is being fought. Kemp believed it could be shaped, controlled, perhaps erased. And you believe he succeeded? I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned down a side street, his pace quickening. I believe, he said at last, that someone has already paid the price for that belief, and that the truth, once uncovered, will explain why you, my dear Watson, will one day wish this story had remained untold. Even then, I felt a chill at his words, though I could not have guessed how fully they would be borne out by what was yet to come. Holmes's remark as we parted from Dr. Harding clung to my thoughts with an unpleasant persistence. That there existed truths better left concealed was not a notion new to me. The practice of medicine had long acquainted me with the frailty of the human mind when confronted with horrors beyond its preparation. Yet there was something in Holmes's tone, measured, almost regretful, that suggested this case trespassed upon regions even he approached with caution. We walked in silence for some minutes, the din of London traffic rising and falling about us like the pulse of some vast organism. At length, Holmes hailed a hansom and directed the driver toward the embankment. "The warehouse," I said, breaking the quiet. "Yes," Holmes replied. If Kemp wished to work unobserved, he would require a place both accessible and anonymous. The river provides both. The warehouse stood in a narrow lane branching off the wharf, a squat brick building whose windows were grimy with soot and whose doors bore the scars of long use. It presented no outward sign of unusual activity. Indeed, it might have escaped notice entirely had Holmes not insisted upon its inspection. We dismissed the cab and approached on foot. Holmes paused, studying the ground. "Observe," he said softly. "Two sets of footprints, one heavy, one light. Recent. The lighter gate hesitates at the door." "Someone uncertain," I suggested. "Or someone not accustomed to this place," Holmes replied. "Now note the heavier prints. Decisive. Purposeful. Blake, I should think." The door was locked, but Holmes required little time to defeat it. Within, the air was cold and carried the faint odor of chemicals. Crates lay stacked along the walls, some opened, revealing glassware, coils of wire, and instruments whose purpose I could only guess. Holmes moved among them with a practiced eye. "These are not merely supplies," he said. "They are components of a system." At the far end of the warehouse stood a partition, crudely erected. Holmes pushed it aside, revealing a smaller chamber beyond. Here the sense of unease deepened. A chair stood in the center of the room, fitted with leather straps. Nearby, a table bore an array of instruments, electrodes, syringes, and a curious apparatus resembling a crown of metal filaments. I felt a tightening in my chest. "Good God, Holmes, this is not medicine. It is torture." Holmes shook his head slowly. "It is neither. Or rather, it is both. The line between healing and harm is perilously thin when one meddles with the mind." He knelt beside the chair, examining the floor. "Blood," he murmured. "Small quantity. And here, scuff marks. A struggle, but not prolonged." "You believe someone was held here recently?" I asked. "Within days," Holmes replied. "And released or removed." A sudden sound echoed from beyond the partition. A footstep, hurried and unsteady. Holmes rose in an instant, drawing his revolver. "Show yourself," he commanded. A figure emerged, hands raised. It was Mrs. Allen. Her face was pale, her eyes wild. "You must not be here," she said. "You do not understand." "Then enlighten us," Holmes replied. She shook her head. "It is too late." Before Holmes could respond, a second figure appeared. Blake. His expression was grim, resolute. "You were warned," he said. "And you," Holmes replied, "were followed." Blake laughed bitterly. "Then all is lost." He lunged, not at Holmes, but at Mrs. Allen, seizing her arm. "You told them," he accused. "I had to," she sobbed. "I could not bear it any longer." Holmes stepped forward. "Release her, Mr. Blake. Your cause gains nothing by further violence." Blake hesitated, his grip loosening. In that moment, I acted, bringing the butt of my revolver down upon his wrist. He cried out and staggered back. Holmes sprang forward, disarming him with practiced ease. Blake collapsed into a chair, his defiance ebbing. "You think you are righteous," he said, "but you do not know what he achieved." "Then tell us," Holmes said. Blake laughed hollowly. He freed them, from memory, from guilt, from pain. Mrs. Allen sank to her knees. "And from themselves," she whispered. Holmes's face was grave. "Dr. Kemp experimented upon unwilling subjects." "No," Blake insisted. "They came willingly. They begged him." "Desperation is not consent," Holmes replied. Blake looked away. One of them was too far gone. The procedure stripped away more than intended. He became empty. "And this man?" Holmes asked. Blake's voice faltered. "He wanders now, without past or purpose." Holmes turned to Mrs. Allen. "Is Dr. Kemp alive?" "Yes," she said faintly, "but he is not well." "Where is he?" She gestured toward the river. "Below." Holmes followed her gaze to a trap door in the floor, half concealed by crates. He opened it, revealing steps descending into darkness. As we stood upon the threshold, a low, incoherent murmur drifted upward, a voice speaking fragments without meaning. Holmes's expression hardened. "Watson," he said quietly, "whatever lies below, remember this moment, for it marks the point at which inquiry gives way to reckoning." We descended together, the darkness closing around us, and with it the certainty that the mystery we pursued was far deeper and far more terrible than I had yet imagined. The steps beneath the trapdoor descended more steeply than I had anticipated, their stone worn smooth by long neglect. Holmes went first, his revolver held low but ready, while I followed close behind, my senses straining against the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, carrying with it a damp, metallic scent that set my nerves on edge. Somewhere below us, the incoherent murmuring continued, now louder, now fading, like the muttering of a troubled sleeper. At the foot of the stairs, we emerged into a low-ceilinged chamber lit by a single gas lamp. Its feeble glow revealed a scene which, once witnessed, can never be entirely forgotten. The room was sparsely furnished, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair drawn up close to the wall. Seated upon that chair was a man. He was of middle age, his hair once dark but now streaked with grey, his features refined enough to suggest education and intelligence. Yet there was something profoundly amiss in his expression. His eyes, though open, did not focus upon us. They drifted aimlessly, as though seeking some point of reference forever beyond reach. His lips moved continuously, forming fragments of words, names, perhaps, or phrases shorn of context. Mrs. Allen sank to her knees with a cry. "Oh, sir," she whispered, "what have they done to you?" Holmes stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled emotion. "This is not Dr. Kemp," he said. Blake, who had followed us despite Holmes's efforts to restrain him, nodded grimly. "No, this is Mr. Elias Morton." The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes's eyes narrowed. "The financier," he said slowly, "declared bankrupt 2 years ago, rumoured to have taken his own life." Blake laughed bitterly. "Rumoured, yes. Kemp saved him." "By erasing his memory," Holmes replied. "By freeing him," Blake insisted. "Morton begged for it. He could not endure the disgrace, the knowledge of what he had lost." Holmes knelt before the man, examining him closely. "Can you hear me?" he asked gently. The man's gaze flickered, but there was no recognition. He began to hum softly, a tuneless, unsettling sound. "What have you done to him?" I demanded. Blake's voice broke. "We followed Kemp's method precisely, but something went wrong. Too much was taken away." Holmes rose, his expression grave. "Memory is not a collection of isolated fragments," he said. "It is the scaffold upon which identity is built. Remove too much, and the structure collapses." Mrs. Allen covered her face. "Dr. Kemp did not intend this," she said. "He was horrified when he saw the result." "And yet he continued," Holmes said. "For a time," she admitted, "he believed he could reverse it." "Could he?" I asked. She shook her head. "No." Holmes turned to Blake. "Where is Dr. Kemp now?" Blake hesitated, then gestured toward a second door at the rear of the chamber. "In the adjoining room. He does not wish to be disturbed." Holmes approached the door and paused, listening. From beyond came the faint sound of movement and a low, steady breathing. He opened it. The room beyond was smaller, more cramped, yet far more orderly. Papers were stacked neatly upon a table, instruments laid out with meticulous care. Seated at the desk was a man I recognized at once from descriptions, Dr. Alistair Kemp. He looked older than his years, his shoulders bowed, his once vigorous frame diminished. He turned as we entered, his eyes sharp and alert despite his evident exhaustion. "So," he said quietly, "you have found me." Holmes inclined his head. "Dr. Kemp." "I wondered how long it would take," Kemp continued. "You have a reputation for persistence." "You have one for brilliance," Holmes replied, "and for recklessness." Kemp smiled faintly. "Those two are often mistaken for one another." Holmes did not return the smile. "You have committed acts that place you beyond the pale of accepted practice." Kemp's gaze flickered toward the adjoining room. "You have seen the result." "I have," Holmes said. "And I must ask you plainly, how many others?" Kemp hesitated. "3. "And how many successes?" Holmes asked. "1, Kemp replied. "Perhaps 2. "And the failures?" Kemp's voice faltered. "Unintended consequences." Holmes stepped closer. "You experimented upon human beings without oversight, without consent, free of coercion." "They came willingly," Kemp protested. "They sought relief from unbearable torment." "Desperation clouds judgment," Holmes replied. "You of all men should have known that." Kemp laughed softly. "You speak of ethics as though they were immutable laws. I sought to alleviate suffering." "And in doing so," Holmes said, "you created suffering of another kind." A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken truths. At last, Kemp spoke again, his voice low. "You do not understand," he said. "What I discovered, what I nearly perfected, would have changed everything. The mind could be healed as the body is healed, trauma erased, guilt removed." "And responsibility?" Holmes asked. "Does that vanish as well?" Kemp looked away. That is the question that haunts me. From the adjoining room came a sudden cry, sharp, anguished. Mrs. Allen rushed to Morton's side, soothing him with murmured words. Holmes's gaze hardened. "This man is not healed," he said. "He is broken." Kemp closed his eyes. "I know. And yet you continue to hide," Holmes went on. "To conceal your work, to silence inquiry." Kemp opened his eyes. "Because the truth would destroy more than it saves." Holmes regarded him intently. "Or because it would destroy you." Before Kemp could respond, commotion sounded above. The heavy tread of boots, voices raised in alarm. "The police," Blake said hoarsely. "Harding must have called them." Holmes did not turn. "Good," he said. "This matter has already exceeded the bounds of private resolution." Kemp slumped back in his chair. "Then it is finished." "No," Holmes replied. "It is only beginning." As the voices drew nearer, I felt a profound unease settle upon me. For though the central figures of this grim drama now stood revealed, the full implications of their actions, the ripples spreading outward through countless unseen lives, remained obscure. And I could not shake the dreadful suspicion that what we had uncovered beneath the warehouse was but a fragment of a far larger, far more unsettling truth. The arrival of the police, though inevitable, brought with it a complication Holmes had foreseen, and yet could not entirely control. The narrow stairway filled quickly with uniforms, their boots striking the stone with an authority that seemed almost incongruous in that subterranean chamber of broken minds and whispered regrets. Inspector Lestrade himself emerged from the press, his expression one of mingled triumph and irritation. "Holmes," he exclaimed, "you might have waited for us." Holmes inclined his head. "Time, my dear Lestrade, was not a luxury we possessed." Lestrade took in the scene with a practiced eye. The chair with its straps, the vacant-eyed figure of Morton murmuring to himself, Kemp seated rigidly at his desk, Blake standing apart like a chastened guard dog, and Mrs. Allen clinging desperately to her former employer. "Well," Lestrade said at last, "this is a pretty business." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and one which will not improve upon closer inspection." Lestrade's gaze settled upon Kemp. "Dr. Alistair Kemp, you are under arrest on suspicion of unlawful confinement, grievous bodily harm, and a number of lesser charges, which I expect will multiply as we proceed." Kemp did not resist. He rose slowly, his movements stiff, as though the very act of standing were an effort. "I expected as much," he said quietly. Morton began to wail then, a sudden piercing sound that echoed off the stone walls. Mrs. Allen turned on Lestrade, her eyes blazing. "You cannot take him," she cried. "He needs care. He does not understand." Lestrade hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "We'll see that he's looked after, madam." Holmes stepped forward. "Inspector, this man is not a criminal in the conventional sense. He is a victim, perhaps the most tragic of them all." Lestrade frowned. "Victim or not, he's evidence." "Evidence that will deteriorate rapidly under improper handling," Holmes replied. "His condition requires immediate medical supervision of a specialized kind." Lestrade glanced at me. "Is that so, Doctor?" "It is," I said gravely. "Any sudden shock, any attempt to interrogate him, could exacerbate his condition irreparably." Lestrade sighed. "Very well. I'll have him taken to St. Bartholomew's under guard." Kemp flinched. "No," he said sharply. "Not there." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Why not?" Kemp hesitated, then shook his head. "Too many memories." Memories, Holmes echoed softly. As the police began their grim work, securing the premises, cataloguing instruments, escorting Blake away in handcuffs, I found myself standing beside Holmes, watching as Kemp was led up the stairs. For a moment, our eyes met. In his gaze, I saw not defiance, nor even fear, but a profound weariness. "He believes he has failed," I murmured. "He has," Holmes replied. "But failure is not always the end of a man's influence." The warehouse was sealed, its secrets now the property of the Crown. Yet as we emerged into the open air, the river flowing dark and implacable beside us, I felt no sense of resolution, only a deepening unease. "You think this will not end with Kemp?" I said. Holmes nodded. "Ideas, once loosed, do not submit easily to confinement. Kemp's work will not vanish simply because he is silenced." In the days that followed, London buzzed with rumours. Whispers circulated in medical circles of a scandal suppressed, of papers seized and destroyed, of patients quietly relocated. The newspapers, curiously restrained, spoke only of irregular practices and an unfortunate lapse in judgment. Names were omitted, details blurred. Dr. Harding withdrew abruptly from public life, citing ill health. Mercer vanished from London altogether, bound, I later learned, for the continent. Blake was sentenced to a term of imprisonment, his fanaticism recast by the courts as misguided loyalty. As for Morton, I visited him at St. Bartholomew's. He recognized no one, remembered nothing. Yet there were moments, fleeting, heartbreaking, when his eyes would sharpen, his posture straighten, as though some buried fragment of himself struggled toward the light, only to sink back again into oblivion. Holmes accompanied me on one such visit. We stood together at the foot of Morton's bed, watching as he slept. "You see," Holmes said quietly, "the paradox. Had Kemp succeeded completely, we might be standing before a man relieved of suffering, freed from torment." "And instead?" I asked. "Instead, we see the cost of hubris," Holmes replied. "The mind is not a mechanism to be adjusted at will. It is an organism shaped by experience. Strip away the shaping, and you strip away the man." That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes surprised me by taking up his violin. The melody he drew forth was low and plaintive, filled with a yearning that spoke of unresolved questions. When he finished, he laid the instrument aside with a sigh. "You are troubled," I said. "Yes," he admitted. "Not by what has been done, but by what might yet be attempted. There are others who will look upon Kemp's work and see not its failure, but its promise." "And what then?" I asked. Holmes met my gaze. "Then we shall see how far the pursuit of knowledge may be allowed to go before it ceases to be humane." I could not then know that his words were prophetic, that the case we believed concluded was merely entering a new and more insidious phase, one in which the boundaries between criminality and compassion would blur still further, and in which even Holmes himself would be forced to confront the limits of his formidable intellect. If I have learned anything in my long association with Sherlock Holmes, it is that the conclusion of a case rarely coincides with the cessation of danger. The machinery of justice may grind to a halt, satisfied with its own exertions, while subtler forces continue to move unchecked beneath the surface. In the weeks following Dr. Kemp's arrest, London appeared to resume its accustomed rhythms. Yet to Holmes, and by contagion to myself, the city had acquired an altered aspect, as though a familiar melody were being played in a different key. Holmes spent those weeks in an uncharacteristic state of restlessness. He rose late, paced often and abandoned several promising cases with an impatience I had seldom seen in him. When I remarked upon this change, he merely shrugged. "I am waiting," he said. "For what?" I asked. "For the aftershock." It was not long in coming. One morning, as I sat perusing the medical journals in the sitting room, Holmes entered with a letter in his hand. He did not offer it to me at once, but stood by the mantelpiece, turning it over thoughtfully. "This arrived by special messenger," he said. "No name, no return address." I set aside my journal. "Another warning?" "Not precisely." He handed me the letter. It contained only a single sentence, written in a firm, deliberate hand. "You have closed one door and opened 3 more." I looked up. "A threat?" "A statement," Holmes replied, "and an accurate one." He crossed to his desk and unlocked a drawer I had never seen opened before. From it, he withdrew a thin sheaf of papers, notes, diagrams, and letters, some bearing dates from years past. "These," he said, "are the remnants of earlier inquiries, cases that never reached a satisfactory conclusion because the evidence was insufficient or the consequences too diffuse." "And you believe they are connected to Kemp?" I asked. "Connected," Holmes replied, "not by person, but by principle." He spread the papers upon the desk. As I examined them, a pattern emerged. Reports of patients who had undergone inexplicable changes in personality. Accounts of sudden emotional numbness following minor surgical procedures. Rumors of experimental therapies conducted under the guise of legitimate treatment. "You think Kemp was not alone?" I said slowly. "I think," Holmes replied, "that Kemp was part of a current, a movement, if you will, that has flowed quietly through certain circles for years. He was merely the most reckless among them." That afternoon, we received a visit from Inspector Lestrade, whose usual bluff confidence was notably subdued. "I've had orders from above," he said, once he was seated. "The Kemp matter is to be considered closed." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Closed?" "Papers sealed. Evidence restricted. Certain names removed from the record." "And the reasons?" Holmes asked. Lestrade hesitated. "National interest, they say. Fear of panic. Fear of misuse." Holmes's lips curved in a mirthless smile. "Fear of exposure." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "You didn't hear it from me." "Of course not," Holmes replied. After Lestrade departed, Holmes stood gazing into the fire. "When institutions fear ideas," he said, "they do not destroy them. They bury them where they may germinate unseen." It was during this period that a second, more personal disturbance arose, one which I confess I would gladly have omitted from this narrative, had its significance been less profound. I began to experience lapses. At first, they were trivial. A forgotten appointment, a misplaced book. I attributed them to fatigue. But soon there were moments, brief, disquieting, when a familiar street would appear strange to me, or a name long known would elude recall. I mentioned this to Holmes one evening, half in jest. "Overwork," I said, "or advancing years." Holmes did not smile. He regarded me intently. "When did this begin?" "I cannot say precisely." "Since the warehouse?" he asked. I hesitated. "Perhaps." He nodded slowly. "You must submit to examination." I laughed. "Surely you do not suspect—" "I suspect nothing," Holmes interrupted. "But I will not ignore a variable so close at hand." He questioned me closely, testing my memory, my reflexes, my powers of observation. I passed these trials with ease, yet I could see that Holmes remained unsatisfied. "You have been under considerable strain," he said at last. "We shall monitor the situation." It was only later that night, as I lay awake, that the true horror of the thought struck me. That Kemp's influence might extend not merely through his ideas, but through his actions. That his experiments might have reached further than we knew, touching lives without their owner's knowledge. The next development came in the form of a patient. She was brought to Baker Street by her brother, a gaunt man with hollow eyes and a manner worn thin by anxiety. The patient herself was young, scarcely 20, and possessed of a beauty rendered uncanny by her complete emotional detachment. "She does not feel," her brother said simply. "Not joy, not sorrow, not fear." Holmes questioned her gently. She answered politely, intelligently, yet without inflection. Her gaze was steady, untroubled. "Have you undergone any medical treatment recently?" Holmes asked. "Yes," she replied. "A course of therapy for grief." "Where?" She named a private clinic in Bloomsbury. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. After they departed, Holmes stood in silence for a long time. "You see now," he said at last, "the door that was opened." "And the others?" I asked. Holmes's voice was grave. "One leads to the past, one to the present, and one to us." That night, I dreamed of a vast library, its shelves stripped bare, its catalogues burned. Men and women wandered its aisles, searching for volumes that no longer existed, their faces blank with bewilderment. I awoke with the echo of Holmes's words ringing in my ears. The case, I realized then, was no longer about Dr. Kemp alone. It had become a question of memory itself, of who might claim the right to alter it and at what cost. And in that question lay a danger far greater than any single crime. The quiet erasure of what makes us human, accomplished not by force, but by persuasion cloaked in the language of mercy. The weeks that followed were among the most unsettling of my life, not for any single dramatic event, but for the cumulative pressure of small disquieting irregularities that resisted explanation. Holmes was correct. The arrest of Dr. Kemp had closed one door only to reveal others beyond, each leading into corridors darker and less defined than the last. The sense that we were no longer pursuing a single offender, but rather tracing the outline of an idea that had escaped its originator, weighed heavily upon us both. Holmes approached this new phase of inquiry with a methodical restraint that I found at once reassuring and ominous. He refused to act hastily, preferring instead to gather fragments, testimonies, medical reports, whispered rumors, allowing them to accumulate until their collective weight forced a pattern into view. Yet even he could not wholly disguise the strain under which he labored. "You see, Watson," he said one evening as we sat before the fire, "crime is usually an aberration, a deviation from the norm. But what we face here is an adaptation. It wears the semblance of benevolence and thus evades the natural defenses of society." The clinic in Bloomsbury, named discreetly the Clarendon Institute, presented itself as a respectable establishment devoted to the treatment of nervous disorders. Its founders were men of impeccable credentials, its patrons individuals of means and influence. There was nothing overtly sinister in its facade. Yet Holmes's instincts, sharpened by long experience, detected beneath its polished exterior a troubling resonance with Kemp's discredited work. We presented ourselves as prospective clients, Holmes adopting the guise of a gentleman seeking treatment for persistent insomnia, while I played the role of his concerned associate. The physician who received us, a smooth-spoken man named Dr. Hawthorne, listened attentively, nodding with professional sympathy. "Our methods are entirely non-invasive," Hawthorne assured us. "We aim to alleviate suffering, not to probe it unnecessarily." Holmes inclined his head. "And the mechanism?" "A combination of guided recollection, mild electrical stimulation, and pharmacological support," Hawthorne replied. "Nothing experimental." "Nothing experimental," Holmes repeated, his tone neutral. As we toured the facility, I could not shake the impression that the patients we glimpsed, walking placidly through sunlit corridors or seated quietly in common rooms, shared a certain sameness of expression. They were calm, orderly, and curiously detached, as though the sharper edges of their personalities had been filed away. "You observe it too," Holmes murmured as we departed. "Yes," I said. "A tranquility bordering on vacancy." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "An absence of conflict achieved at the expense of depth." Our inquiries soon revealed that several physicians associated with the Institute had corresponded with Kemp in years past. Their letters, though cautious, betrayed a shared fascination with the malleability of memory. Kemp's downfall, it seemed, had served less as a warning than as a lesson in discretion. The implications of this discovery troubled me deeply, not least because of my own continuing lapses. Though subtle, they persisted. A face momentarily unrecognized, a familiar fact recalled only after effort. Holmes observed these symptoms with increasing concern, though he refrained from comment unless pressed. It was during this period that I received a letter in a hand I did not at once recognize. It bore no signature, only an address in Chelsea and a single line. "If you wish to understand what has been taken from you, come alone." I showed it to Holmes at once. "A provocation," he said, "and a dangerous one." "You do not think," I began. "I think," Holmes replied, "that someone has been observing you as closely as we have observed them." Despite his objections, I insisted upon keeping the appointment, though not without certain precautions of Holmes's devising. The address proved to be a modest lodging house overlooking the river. I was shown upstairs to a small parlor where a woman awaited me. She was pale and composed, her manner restrained yet intense. "Dr. Watson," she said, "thank you for coming." "You wrote to me," I said. "You claim to know something of my condition." She nodded. "My name is Eleanor Finch. I was a patient of Dr. Kemp." I felt a chill. "You underwent his procedures?" "Yes, and I remember what was done to me, because it failed." She explained that Kemp's early experiments had been inconsistent. In some subjects, memory suppression had proved incomplete, leaving behind gaps through which awareness might resurface. Finch was one such subject. "He sought to erase my grief," she said. "Instead, he fractured it." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I remember losing something," she replied. "But not what. The emotion remains, unattached to its cause." Her words struck an uncomfortably familiar chord. "You believe something similar has happened to me," I said slowly. "Yes," she replied, "and not by Kemp." She produced a small vial from her pocket. "This was administered to me at the Clarendon Institute under the guise of a sedative." I examined it. "And you suspect?" "That they are continuing his work," she said. "Refined, disguised, but fundamentally the same." A sudden realization dawned upon me. You arranged this meeting not merely to warn me, but to enlist me. She met my gaze steadily. You have access to Holmes. He has the means to expose them. I returned to Baker Street shaken, my mind reeling with implications. Holmes listened in silence as I recounted the encounter. At last, he said quietly, we have confirmation of what we suspected. And my lapses? I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. He crossed to the window, staring out at the lamplit street. You have been under observation, Watson, he said at last. Perhaps even subjected to preliminary intervention. The words struck me like a blow. Without my knowledge? Without your consent, Holmes replied, which, as Kemp discovered too late, is the most dangerous violation of all. That night, as I sat alone in my room, I attempted to reconstruct my recent days with meticulous care, probing my memory for gaps, inconsistencies, anything that might confirm or refute Holmes's grim hypothesis. The effort left me exhausted and no wiser. Yet one thing was clear. The mystery had turned inward. The question was no longer merely who was responsible, but how much had already been lost, and whether what was taken could ever be reclaimed. In that uncertainty lay the true terror of the case, that the crime might be accomplished so subtly that even its victims could not be certain they had been wronged at all. The revelation that my own mind might have been tampered with, however tentatively, introduced into the case an intimacy which I should have preferred to avoid. Yet, if it disturbed me, it galvanized Holmes. His manner, which for weeks had been restrained almost to the point of languor, now sharpened into something cold and precise. I recognized the change at once. It was the same transformation I had witnessed when a case ceased to be abstract and became personal. We proceed, he said, not with haste, but with absolute discretion. The Clarendon Institute, once merely a troubling curiosity, now assumed the aspect of a fortress, its polished respectability a mask behind which profound violations might be concealed. Holmes determined that direct confrontation would be premature. Instead, he resolved upon infiltration, employing methods as subtle as those used against us. Our first step was to acquire patience, not in the literal sense, but through careful inquiry among physicians whose discretion was for sale and whose loyalty could be bent by persuasion or fear. Holmes cultivated these contacts with consummate skill, presenting himself not as an accuser, but as a fellow investigator, concerned with theoretical implications rather than legal culpability. In this way, he obtained access to case summaries, sanitized, incomplete, yet revealing in their omissions. "What do you observe?" he asked me one evening, spreading several such reports upon the table. I studied them closely. Patterns of emotional flattening, reduction in intrusive memories, but also diminished spontaneity, creativity impaired. "Just so," Holmes replied. "They remove pain by amputating depth, a crude solution, however elegantly described. And always," I added, "with the patient's consent, at least nominally." Holmes's lips thinned. Consent obtained under conditions of distress is consent in name only. The law may yet learn that lesson. Our second step was riskier. Holmes arranged for me, despite my protests, to present myself once more at the Clarendon Institute, this time openly, as a physician seeking consultation for my own symptoms. He insisted upon accompanying me, posing as a concerned colleague. Dr. Hawthorne received us again, his manner unchanged, courteous, attentive, untroubled. "You experience memory lapses?" he asked me. "Disorientation?" "Occasionally," I replied. "And emotional disturbance?" he pressed. "I cannot say," I answered honestly. "How would one recognize its absence?" He smiled indulgently. "Quite so." As he spoke, I became aware of a subtle tension beneath his polished manner, a watchfulness that suggested more than professional interest. Holmes, I observed, was equally alert, his questions casual yet incisive, probing the boundaries of Hawthorne's prepared responses. "We are particularly interested," Holmes said lightly, "in the ethical framework guiding your treatments." Hawthorne's smile tightened just perceptibly. "Ethics evolve, Mr. Holmes. What was once unthinkable becomes necessary when suffering demands it." "An argument much favored by pioneers," Holmes replied, "and by tyrants." Hawthorne's eyes hardened. "Strong words. Strong ideas," Holmes corrected. The interview concluded without incident, yet as we departed I was seized by a sudden dizziness, a brief but alarming sensation, as though the room had shifted imperceptibly beneath my feet. Holmes steadied me with a firm hand. "You see," he murmured, "observation breeds reaction." That evening, Holmes confirmed what he had suspected. During my visit, I had been administered a mild sedative without my knowledge, likely introduced into the tea offered us upon arrival. "A test," he said, "to assess susceptibility." "And the result?" I asked. Holmes met my gaze grimly. "Inconclusive." It was then that Holmes made a decision which surprised me. "We must allow them to proceed," he said. "You mean?" I began. "I mean," he replied, "that we permit them to believe their influence over you is increasing. Only thus will they reveal the full extent of their methods." I objected vehemently. The prospect of subjecting my own mind to further manipulation filled me with dread, yet Holmes was inexorable. "You trust me," he said quietly. "I do," I replied. "Then trust me now." Reluctantly, I consented. Over the next fortnight, I submitted to a series of consultations at the Institute, always under Holmes's watchful eye, though never openly. My sensations during this period are difficult to describe with precision. There were moments of profound calm, during which the anxieties that had long haunted me seemed distant and unimportant. Yet these moments were followed by an equally profound emptiness, a sense that something vital had been dulled. I recorded my impressions meticulously, as Holmes instructed, noting even the smallest irregularity. He compared these notes with his own observations, correlating them with fluctuations in my mood, my recall, my responsiveness. "They are refining their approach," he concluded. "Incremental, reversible, at least in theory." "And in practice?" I asked. Holmes hesitated. "That remains to be seen." The turning point came with Eleanor Finch. She vanished. Her lodgings were found undisturbed, her belongings intact, yet she herself was nowhere to be found. Holmes traced her last movements to a private annex of the Clarendon Institute, accessible only to senior staff. "They have silenced her," I said. "Or relocated her," Holmes replied, "which may be worse." Holmes acted then with decisive speed. He summoned Lestrade, presenting him with evidence so meticulously assembled that even official reluctance could not suppress it entirely. Warrants were obtained, though hedged about with restrictions. The raid occurred at dawn. We accompanied the police, entering the institute through a side entrance. The corridors, once serene, were now scenes of controlled chaos as officers secured rooms and detained staff. Holmes moved with purpose, directing attention to specific areas, bypassing others entirely. In the annex, we found Finch. She was seated in a chair much like that I had seen in the warehouse by the river, electrodes affixed to her temples. Her eyes were open, but vacant. Holmes knelt beside her, his face ashen. They went too far. Dr. Hawthorne stood nearby, pale but defiant. "We were helping her," he insisted. "She was unstable." "You were erasing her," Holmes replied. As Finch was removed to medical care, Holmes confronted Hawthorne with the accumulated evidence. Correspondence, records, testimony. The man's composure finally cracked. "You cannot stop this," he said bitterly. "People want relief. They demand it." "From pain, yes," Holmes replied. "Not from responsibility." Hawthorne was arrested along with several colleagues. Yet even as the institute was shuttered, Holmes remained unsatisfied. "This is not the end," he said. "It never is." That night, exhausted and shaken, I attempted once more to probe my own memory, searching for what might have been altered. I succeeded only in unsettling myself further. For how does one measure absence? How does one mourn a loss one cannot name? It was then that I understood, fully and with chilling clarity, why Holmes had warned me that this case would one day be withheld from publication. For its true horror lay not in the crimes uncovered, but in those that might never be detected at all. The silent theft of inner life, committed with the victim's apparent acquiescence. And in that understanding, I felt the first stirrings of a resolve as grim as it was necessary, that whatever the personal cost, this story must eventually be told, if only as a warning to those who might otherwise mistake oblivion for peace. The aftermath of our raid on the Clarendon Institute had not produced the sense of closure that one might have expected. Though Dr. Hawthorne and his colleagues had been detained and the Institute's doors permanently closed, the questions surrounding their practices only seemed to multiply. Even as Finch was placed under medical care, it became clear that the situation was far from resolved. The initial signs pointed toward a single, deeply unsettling conclusion. This was not the work of one man, nor of a single institution. This was something broader, a network operating beneath the surface of society, invisible yet profoundly influential. Holmes did not relax even for a moment. His manner remained sharp, purposeful, his mind working incessantly to connect dots that, even now, seemed scattered and incomplete. For weeks, we pursued leads, both through traditional means and through those less direct methods Holmes had perfected over the years. "Do you think we have seen the full scope of this?" I asked him one evening, as we sat in the cluttered comfort of Baker Street. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "No, this is merely the surface. What we have uncovered at Clarendon was part of a much larger experiment, one with roots reaching back decades." "But how?" I asked, perplexed. "How could it remain hidden for so long?" "Because people wish to be deceived," Holmes replied, his voice cold. "We are not dealing with criminals in the usual sense, Watson. These are men, some of them men of power, who have used scientific advancement as a veil to disguise their true intentions. Which are to manipulate, Watson, to shape minds, memories, and ultimately identities." I frowned. unable to shake the image of the patients we had encountered at the Institute. Those serene, blank-eyed individuals who appeared to have been robbed of everything that made them unique. It was a theft far more insidious than simple physical violence. What had been taken from them was a part of their very essence. But who benefits from this? I asked. And why? Holmes stood, pacing the room, his mind clearly far ahead of the conversation. The answer lies in power, Watson. Control over memory is control over reality itself. If one can dictate what people remember, what they believe, then one can control their actions, their decisions. That is the ultimate weapon. I looked up at him. You mean they were using it as a form of societal control? Precisely. I felt a chill run down my spine. The implications of Holmes's words were staggering, and I began to understand why this case had weighed so heavily upon him. It was not simply a matter of bringing criminals to justice. It was a fight against an idea that could subvert the very foundation of human autonomy. Holmes's eyes flashed. It is only now, Watson, that I am beginning to see the extent of this. But I am not alone in this discovery. There are others who seek to exploit these methods for purposes far more dangerous than anything we have encountered. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Who? A shadow network, Holmes replied, pausing to retrieve a bundle of papers from his desk. What we have seen at the Clarendon Institute is but a small branch of something much larger. I have reason to believe that several individuals, some known, some concealed, are part of this intricate web of manipulation, and they have already set their sights on more ambitious targets. He handed me a series of notes and documents. As I glanced through them, I saw that they were fragments of correspondences, interviews, and medical records. At first, they seemed disconnected, bits and pieces without context. But slowly, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. These individuals had ties to influential figures in government, industry, and even the arts. People who had the power not just to affect change in society, but to redefine it entirely. The question we must answer now, Holmes said, his voice low, is who is pulling the strings behind this mask of benevolence? Who stands to gain from shaping memory itself? I felt a growing sense of unease. And how do we stop them? Holmes's gaze grew more focused. We must first uncover the full extent of their operation. We need to know who is involved, how far their influence extends, and what their endgame truly is. For the next several days, Holmes immersed himself in the details. He visited old contacts, consulted with experts in neurology and psychology, and scoured the city for any trace of this shadow network. I, too, did my part, tracking down individuals who had been treated by the Institute, attempting to connect them to other patients or practitioners who might shed light on the larger operation. It was during one such visit that I encountered a man who would become an unexpected key to understanding this complex web. His name was Geoffrey Shaw, a former patient of the Clarendon Institute who had experienced the same strange emotional flattening that we had observed in others. Shaw was a well-spoken man in his early 40s, a man who had once been deeply involved in the arts and whose sudden withdrawal from public life had been noted by a number of his colleagues. When I met him, he was living in seclusion in a small flat near the River Thames. Shaw was not initially inclined to speak of his experience. He had, he claimed, been cured of his previous afflictions, his chronic depression, his bouts of despair, but at a great personal cost. He described the sensation of having been reset, his emotions tamped down to a point where he could no longer distinguish between the trivial and the profound. His memory, too, had been affected. Faces, names, moments from his past, all had become blurred, as though they belonged to someone else. "You see, Doctor," he said, his voice low, "they gave me a new life, but I can't remember who I was before. I don't feel things the same way. Everything's so flat, and I can't get it back." Shaw's words echoed in my mind long after I left his flat. The notion that one could erase the essence of a person, their very ability to experience the richness of life. What could be more terrifying? Upon further questioning, Shaw admitted something else, something that would soon prove to be a vital piece of the puzzle. He had received a letter several months before his treatment had begun. The letter had come from an anonymous source, urging him to seek out the Clarendon Institute. It was signed with a symbol, a circle with a vertical line through the center. "That symbol," I said, when I relayed this information to Holmes. "It's the same one I saw in one of the reports you found. The correspondence between Kemp and his colleagues." Holmes's eyes narrowed. Indeed. After several more days of investigation, Holmes uncovered the truth about that symbol. It was associated with a secretive society, one that had operated in the shadows for years. This society, comprised of influential figures from various sectors, medicine, politics, finance, had been working on a long-term project to harness the power of memory manipulation as a means of controlling society. Their goal was not to create a utopia, but rather a pliable, malleable society, one where individuals could be shaped and controlled by those at the top. The discovery struck like a bolt from the blue, yet it also brought a terrible clarity to our understanding of the situation. The Clarendon Institute was merely the public face of a far-reaching conspiracy. And now that we knew who was behind it, the stakes could not have been higher. As Holmes pieced together the threads of this vast network, I felt the weight of their implications pressing down upon me. If they succeeded in their aims, there would be no escape, no way to discern truth from fabrication, no way to distinguish the real from the manipulated. "We must act quickly," Holmes said, after reviewing the final pieces of the puzzle, "before they can advance to the next stage of their plan." But as we prepared to confront the heart of this conspiracy, I realized with growing horror that the greatest danger was not from without, but from within. For the longer I spent in the labyrinth of this case, the more I began to doubt my own mind. Had I, too, been subject to their influence? Had my own memories been altered without my knowledge? In the end, it seemed there was no simple way to know. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying part of all. The symbol described by Geoffrey Shaw, the circle bisected by a single vertical line, proved to be the fulcrum upon which the next stage of our inquiry turned. Holmes, upon hearing of it, betrayed the first unmistakable sign of genuine surprise I had seen in him since the affair began. He did not speak at once, but crossed to his bookcases and began removing volumes with rapid precision, stacking them upon the table until a small tower had formed. "At last," he murmured. "I had hoped I was mistaken." From one of the older books, a treatise on secret societies long out of print, he produced an engraving. There, amid a jumble of archaic emblems, was the same symbol. The circle and the line, Holmes said. An old philosophical society, ostensibly defunct. Its origins lie in the late 18th century, though its principles are older still. And those principles? I asked. Perfectibility, Holmes replied. The belief that humanity may be improved through systematic intervention, not merely through education or governance, but through direct alteration of the individual. I felt a tightening in my chest. Of the mind. Of the mind above all, Holmes said. Memory, conscience, identity, these are inefficiencies to such men, variables to be controlled. He explained that the circle and the line had always operated through proxy institutions, clinics, charities, research foundations. Rarely did its members act openly. Instead, they cultivated influence, guiding the ambitions of others and stepping in only when a particular line of inquiry showed promise. Kemp, Holmes continued, was never one of them. He was a useful instrument, brilliant, driven, and ethically flexible. When he became a liability, they withdrew support. And Clarendon? I asked. A trial balloon, Holmes replied. A refinement of Kemp's work, stripped of its cruder excesses and dressed in the language of compassion. This revelation reframed everything we had uncovered. Kemp's isolation, Hawthorne's confidence, the swift sealing of records, all bore the marks of an organization accustomed to shaping outcomes from behind the scenes. What do they want now? I asked. Holmes's answer was immediate. Expansion. He outlined his reasoning with that deliberate care which always preceded his most consequential conclusions. Clarendon had been a controlled environment, its patients drawn largely from those already marginalized by grief or illness. The next step, Holmes argued, would be broader application. Treatments offered not merely as remedies, but as enhancements, means of increasing productivity, stability, and social harmony. A mind relieved of regret is easier to govern, Holmes said quietly. A population freed from inconvenient memories is infinitely malleable. The thought was chilling enough in the abstract. Its immediacy became apparent 2 days later, when Holmes received an invitation. It arrived in the form of a heavy cream envelope, unmarked save for the same stark symbol embossed in black. Inside was a card bearing a single sentence. Mr. Sherlock Holmes is requested to attend a private discourse on the future of mental science. The address was in Mayfair. The date, 3 days hence. They know who you are, I said. They always have, Holmes replied. The question is not whether I attend, but whether I am invited to leave. Despite my objections, Holmes resolved to go. This is an overture, he said. Refusal would only confirm their suspicions. Acceptance grants us access. And me? I asked. You will accompany me, Holmes said, as an observer. The gathering took place in a townhouse of severe elegance, its rooms stripped of ornament, its atmosphere one of austere confidence. We were received by a man who gave his name only as Mr. Langdon, a tall, silver-haired figure whose manner combined courtesy with unmistakable authority. You have been difficult to ignore, Mr. Holmes, Langdon said, as we were shown into a private salon. Your inquiries have brushed close to matters of considerable importance. Holmes smiled faintly. I find that important matters have a way of attracting attention. The salon contained perhaps a dozen individuals, all well-dressed, all bearing the stamp of intellect and influence. Physicians, financiers, civil servants, each introduced without titles, as though rank itself were an inconvenience. The discourse that followed was conducted with remarkable frankness. The speakers spoke of social instability, of the burdens imposed by trauma and dissent, of the inefficiencies of moral conflict. Memory, they argued, was the root of much suffering and much disorder. Imagine, one said, a society unshackled from its worst recollections. Or from its worst impulses, added another. Holmes listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When at last he spoke, it was with deceptive mildness. "And who," he asked, "decides which recollections are worst?" There was a pause. Langdon answered, "Those best equipped to judge." Holmes inclined his head. An answer as old as tyranny. A murmur rippled through the room, though whether of amusement or irritation I could not tell. "You mistake us," Langdon said smoothly. "We seek not domination, but harmony." "Achieved through subtraction," Holmes replied. "A dangerous arithmetic." The meeting concluded without overt hostility, yet as we departed, I felt acutely the weight of unseen scrutiny. Outside, Holmes paused beneath a street lamp, his face drawn. "They are further along than I feared," he said, "and they consider themselves beyond reproach." "And what of Finch?" I asked. "Of Shaw? Of the others already harmed?" Holmes's jaw tightened. Collateral damage in their estimation. That night, I suffered the most severe lapse yet. I awoke unable, for several dreadful seconds, to recall where I was, or who I was. The room seemed unfamiliar, my own name a distant echo. When clarity returned, it did so with a wave of terror that left me shaking. Holmes found me thus, sitting upon the bed, drenched in cold sweat. "It is accelerating," I said hoarsely. He did not deny it. "They may be exerting pressure, testing limits." "Through whom?" I asked. "How?" Holmes hesitated. "That is what we must determine, and quickly." For the first time since our association began, I saw in his eyes not merely concern, but something closer to anger. Controlled, disciplined, yet unmistakable. "They have crossed a line," he said. "Not merely ethically, but tactically. The circle and the line had revealed themselves at last. Not as phantoms, but as men convinced of their own righteousness. And in doing so, they had made a fatal error. They had underestimated the resolve of the one mind they could not afford to treat as malleable." Yet even as Holmes prepared his counterstroke, I could not shake the fear that the ground beneath us was already shifting, that the very faculties upon which we relied might be compromised before the final reckoning could be reached. For how does one fight an enemy who does not merely oppose you, but seeks to decide what you are permitted to remember of the fight itself? If there is a point at which intellectual opposition hardens into personal war, it is the moment one realizes that retreat is no longer possible. Not because the enemy bars the way, but because one's own ground is crumbling beneath one's feet. Such was the juncture at which we now stood. The circle and the line had ceased to be an abstraction, a shadowed hypothesis. They had spoken to us plainly, calmly, with the confidence of men who believe the future already bent to their design. Worse still, they had demonstrated their reach, not through overt force, but through pressure applied where resistance was weakest. My mind. The episodes grew more frequent. They were no longer confined to the fragile borderlands between waking and sleep. I lost minutes in the middle of conversation, Once, while walking with Holmes along the Strand, I found myself standing still while the crowd flowed around me, unable for several dreadful moments to recall where we were going or why. Holmes noticed instantly. "Do not move," he said quietly, his hand firm upon my arm. "Fix your attention upon my voice." I obeyed, clinging to his words as though to a rope thrown across a chasm. Gradually, the world reassembled itself. The noise, the motion, the continuity of purpose. When at last I could speak, my voice shook. "They are not merely observing," I said. "They are acting." "Yes," Holmes replied grimly, and with increasing boldness. He altered his plans that very evening. The methodical gathering of evidence, the cautious cultivation of allies, all was set aside. In their place emerged something far more dangerous, a direct assault upon the Circle's central mechanism of influence. "They rely," Holmes explained, "upon two assumptions. First, that their operations remain deniable. Second, that their subjects are incapable of articulating what has been done to them. We must undermine both." "How?" I asked. "By forcing them into the open," Holmes replied, "and by restoring, if only partially, what they have taken." This latter ambition struck me as wildly optimistic. "You believe memory can be restored?" Holmes hesitated. "I believe interference leaves traces. Kemp himself noted this, though he lacked the patience or the humility to pursue it properly." He produced a small notebook filled with cramped annotations. "I have been studying the records seized from Clarendon. Beneath the euphemisms and omissions, there are references to reversibility, temporary regressions, spontaneous recoveries." "And Finch?" I asked. "And Morton?" Holmes's expression darkened. "In advanced cases, the damage may be irreversible. But you, Watson, you are not an advanced case." The words, meant as reassurance, chilled me nonetheless. Our immediate objective was Mr. Langdon. Holmes had identified him not merely as a spokesman, but as a coordinator, a man whose position bridged the Circle's philosophical core and its practical apparatus. Langdon did not perform experiments, nor did he treat patients. He facilitated, funded, and protected. "Remove him," Holmes said, "and the structure loses coherence." We arranged a meeting. This time it was Holmes who extended the invitation, couching it in the language of reluctant collaboration. He suggested, truthfully enough, that continued opposition would attract attention neither side desired. A private discussion, he implied, might yet yield mutual accommodation. Langdon accepted with remarkable promptness. The meeting took place at an estate outside the city, a severe, isolated house set amid carefully controlled grounds. Holmes insisted that I accompany him, despite my condition. "They must see you," he said, "not as a victim, but as evidence." Langdon received us in a library of austere elegance. He regarded me with open curiosity. "You do not look well, Dr. Watson," he observed. "No," I replied, "and you know why." Langdon did not deny it. "You have been affected, an unfortunate side effect of necessary precautions." "Necessary for whom?" Holmes asked. "For stability," Langdon replied calmly. "For progress." Holmes leaned forward. "You mistake stagnation for stability. You have confused silence with harmony." Langdon smiled faintly. "History will decide." "History," Holmes replied, "requires memory." For the first time, Langdon's composure wavered. Holmes pressed his advantage. He laid before Langdon a series of documents, testimonies from patients, financial records, internal memoranda. Each alone was ambiguous. Together, they formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. "You have cultivated plausible deniability," Holmes said. "But plausibility erodes under accumulation." Langdon studied the papers. "You intend to expose us?" "I intend," Holmes replied, "to disrupt you." Langdon's gaze shifted to me. "And what of him?" he asked. "How reliable is your witness given his condition?" Holmes's voice was iron. "More reliable than you imagine." At that moment, something extraordinary occurred. A memory surfaced. It was not complete, nor was it orderly, but it was unmistakable. A recollection of a consultation I had no memory of attending. A room not unlike those at Clarendon. A voice urging calm, urging trust. The sensation was overwhelming, disorienting, yet accompanied by a surge of clarity so sudden it left me gasping. "You did this," I said, staring at Langdon. "Weeks ago. You authorized it." Langdon's silence was answer enough. Holmes rose. "You see now," he said softly. "Interference leaves scars, and scars can be traced." Langdon recovered himself with effort. "You cannot prove that in court." "Perhaps not," Holmes replied. "But I need not prove it to a jury. Only to those who fear exposure more than prosecution." He revealed then his final stratagem. Copies of the evidence had already been dispatched to journalists of unimpeachable integrity, to foreign academies beyond British influence, to private individuals whose interest in the matter was anything but academic. "A distributed archive," Holmes said. "Attempt to suppress it, and you will only amplify it." Langdon stared at him, his certainty finally shaken. "You would unleash chaos." Holmes shook his head. "No, I would restore agency." The meeting ended without agreement, yet the balance had shifted. Within days, subtle signs of retreat became evident. Clinics closed quietly. Funding was redirected. Correspondence ceased. And my condition, though far from resolved, stabilized. The lapses grew less frequent. The terror receded, though it did not vanish entirely. Holmes remained vigilant, monitoring my progress with tireless attention. "You will recover," he said. "Not completely, perhaps, but sufficiently." "And the circle?" I asked. Holmes's expression was unreadable. "They will adapt. They always do. But they will be cautious now." It was in the aftermath of these events, as my strength gradually returned, that I made a decision Holmes did not at first understand. I resolved that this case must never be published in full. The reasons were many. The fragility of public trust, the danger of imitation, the temptations such knowledge would present to lesser minds. But there, most of all, I feared something else. That in reading it, others might recognize themselves too clearly in its pages, and begin to wonder, as I had wondered, whether their own memories were entirely their own. Thus, I consigned this record to silence, or so I believed. For even as I laid down my pen, I sensed that the story was not truly over, that some truths, once uncovered, do not remain buried, but wait patiently for the moment when they must be spoken, regardless of the cost. And in that uneasy awareness lay the final, unresolved tension of the case. The knowledge that while we had pushed back the darkness, we had not destroyed it, only delayed its return. It is one of the peculiar ironies of human affairs that when danger recedes, it rarely does so with ceremony. There is no trumpet blast to announce the lifting of a siege upon the mind, no clear demarcation between threat and safety. Instead, one wakes to find the air marginally lighter, the shadows less oppressive, and only gradually realizes that some unseen pressure has eased. So it was in the months that followed our confrontation with the circle and the line. Outwardly, London returned to its accustomed rhythms. The Clarendon Institute became, in time, a subject of vague scandal, spoken of in guarded phrases, its true nature blurred by euphemism and official restraint. Dr. Hawthorne was tried, though the charges laid against him bore only a partial resemblance to the reality of his crimes. Others, whose names never appeared in print, withdrew quietly from public life or redirected their interests to less contentious pursuits. The machinery of influence, having been exposed to an unwelcome degree of light, retreated once more into shadow. Holmes watched these developments with an attention that never slackened. He followed the movement of men and money, noted the sudden abandonment of certain research projects, the discreet dissolution of committees that had once wielded considerable authority. Yet he never expressed satisfaction. "They are wounded," he said to me one evening, "but not defeated. Ideas do not perish merely because their advocates are inconvenienced." My own recovery proceeded slowly, unevenly. There were days of almost complete clarity, during which I felt myself restored to something like my former vigor. On others, a fog would descend without warning, dulling my thoughts, loosening the connections between memory and meaning. Holmes assured me that this was to be expected. "The mind," he said, "is remarkably resilient, but it resents intrusion. It heals at its own pace, not ours." I resumed my medical practice in a limited capacity, finding solace in the tangible realities of diagnosis and treatment. Yet even there, the case haunted me. I found myself observing patients with a new, uneasy awareness, attentive not merely to what they remembered, but to what they did not, to the absences in their narratives, the inexplicable calm with which some bore the weight of experiences that should have left deeper marks. It was during this period that Holmes and I spoke for the first time openly of publication. "You will write this," he said one afternoon as we sat together in the familiar sitting room at Baker Street. "I know you well enough to be certain of that." "I will not," I replied at once. He raised an eyebrow. "Not even in altered form?" "Not while the danger persists," I said. "To describe these methods, even obliquely, is to invite their resurrection. There are minds far less scrupulous than Kemp's and far more patient." Holmes regarded me thoughtfully. "You propose silence as a safeguard." "I propose discretion," I said. "There is a difference." He did not argue further, though I could see that he remained unconvinced. Holmes had always believed in the corrective power of truth. I, having seen how easily truth might be reshaped or erased, was no longer so certain. Our final confirmation that the circle and the line had withdrawn, at least temporarily, came in an unexpected form. A parcel arrived one morning, delivered by hand, bearing no return address. Inside was a single object, a small metal disc engraved with a familiar symbol. It had been snapped cleanly in two. Holmes examined it in silence. "A message," he said at last. "A threat?" I asked. "No," he replied. "An acknowledgement." "Of defeat?" "Of restraint," Holmes corrected. "They concede this field, for now." "And what of the future?" I asked. Holmes closed his fingers around the broken symbol. "The future," he said, "belongs to those who remember." It was not until much later, years in fact, that I came fully to appreciate the weight of those words. Time, which blunts even the sharpest memories, did its work upon me as well. The lapses became less frequent, then rarer still, until at last they were scarcely distinguishable from the ordinary forgetfulness of advancing age. Yet I never regained quite the same confidence in my own recollections. There were moments, quiet, introspective moments, when I would pause and wonder whether some subtle alteration had become so thoroughly integrated into my being that I could no longer perceive it as foreign. Holmes, too, was changed by the case, though he would never have admitted it. He grew more guarded in his pursuits, more selective in the problems he chose to engage. On several occasions, when presented with matters involving experimental science or novel theories of the mind, he declined with a firmness that surprised those who knew him only by reputation. "I have seen where such paths may lead," he said once. "That is sufficient. As for Eleanor Finch, her fate remains uncertain. She recovered enough to resume an independent existence, though her letters to me, few and carefully worded, suggested that she lived with a persistent sense of estrangement from her own past. Geoffrey Shaw I never saw again. Morton died quietly in an institution, his identity never restored, his life reduced to a sequence of unconnected moments. These, then, were the human costs, the ledger that no tribunal could fully balance. In the end, I sealed my notes, consigning them to a locked drawer where they lay undisturbed for many years. I told myself that this was prudence, that the world was better served by ignorance than by a knowledge it could not be trusted to wield wisely. Yet even as I did so, I was aware of an unspoken contradiction. For memory, as Holmes taught me, is not merely a record of the past. It is the means by which we learn, by which we guard against repetition, by which we remain human in the face of forces that would reduce us to something more manageable, more convenient. It is for this reason, and this reason alone, that I now permit this account to be read, albeit with names altered and certain particulars obscured. The danger has not vanished. It may never do so entirely. But silence, I have come to believe, carries dangers of its own. Some cases end with an arrest, a confession, or a neatly drawn conclusion. This one ended with a choice to remember, even when remembering was painful, to preserve uncertainty rather than accept a false peace purchased at the cost of selfhood. Holmes once told me that the most dangerous criminals are not those who break the law, but those who seek to redefine it. I would add that the most dangerous crimes are not always those that spill blood, but those that quietly erase the very capacity to recognize loss. This, then, was the case I forbade myself to publish, not because it lacked a solution, nor because justice failed entirely, but because its implications were too vast, too intimate, and too easily misused. And yet, even now, I cannot say with certainty that my silence was the wiser course. For somewhere, perhaps even as these words are read, another circle may be drawn, another line inscribed, another mind persuaded that suffering may be eliminated, not by understanding, but by forgetting. If that day comes, I can only hope that there will be those who remember enough to resist, and that they will recognize, as I did at last, that memory, fragile, fallible and burdened though it may be, is the last defense against the most profound form of theft the human spirit can endure.